A Night at the Opera 50 Years is a brand new book from Gillian Garr, a book that I really enjoyed. We're going to get deep into Queen on Rock History Music. Before they conquered stadiums, before Bohemian Rhapsody shook the airwaves, Queen was a band on a mission, driven, meticulous, and willing to gamble everything for their sound. Their debut album, simply titled Queen in '73, introduced a band that blended heavy guitar riffs with grandiose ambition. The song Keep Yourself Alive gave the fans their first taste of Brian May's signature tone. But unfortunately, the album at that time barely made a dent commercially. Queen 2 followed quickly in 1974, a sprawling theatrical concept album filled with layered harmonies, medieval themes, and Freddie Mercury's emerging flair for drama. Songs like Ogre Battle and The March of the Black Queen foreshadowed the band's future brilliance. They weren't radio hits, but became cult favorites. Later that year, the album Sheer Heart Attack became the turning point. Killer Queen became their first major hit, a cheeky blend of camp and sophistication. Suddenly, Queen wasn't just experimental, they were popular. The album climbed the charts on both sides of the Atlantic, showing they could be flashy and commercial. But it was the album A Night at the Opera in 1975 that changed everything. With EMI and Elektra funding one of the most expensive albums ever made, at that time at least, Queen recorded across multiple studios using cutting-edge technologies. They poured their souls into this record and their bank accounts in every single note. The result? A dazzling genre-defying album blending hard rock, vaudeville, classical, and pop. And at the center of all this, the single Bohemian Rhapsody, a 6-minute operatic epic with no chorus, no precedent, and no compromise. It defied every radio rule, and yet it became a global anthem. Bohemian Rhapsody hit #1 in the UK and eventually went platinum in the US, transforming Queen from ambitious outsiders into rock royalty. And it wasn't luck. It was a result of years of relentless experimentation, risk-taking, and belief in their own mission. A Night at the Opera wasn't just an album. It was Queen's declaration of independence, the sound of a band refusing to be ordinary, a reminder that greatness is earned, not given. And they earned it, one painstaking, glorious track at a time. When I read one of these books, I just want to learn stuff. But more than that, I also want an author that I can trust, who has a way with words, who can tell a story. Gillian Garr certainly is that. She's written books on Green Day, Nirvana, the Beatles, women in rock and roll. And now, 50 years, Queen and Night of the Opera, released in 1975. Our conversation with the great Gillian Garr on Rock History Music. I didn't know this, that Brian, when Freddy died in '91, I didn't realize the same year Brian's dad had also died.
Yeah, I mean, so that really must have been, like a double blow for him.
Yeah, the fact that, and you had put in the book that he had said that there was a kind of a hopeless feeling. I mean, Freddie, your dad and Freddie Mercury, two larger than life figures, no matter how you cut it.
Yeah, yeah. And plus, not just Freddie losing the friend, but that, that was their business, if you will. And, until they came back in this later incarnation, Brian said he thought those touring days were over for him.
Yeah.
His band was gone. You're obviously not going to replace Freddie in the band. So, Queen was over for then. And he didn't know it would be different otherwise. So I think there's another sadness too. You kind of not lost your livelihood entirely, because of course he played with other people and does his own projects, but still,
Yeah.
losing your main gig like that.
Forgotten, you'd mentioned it in the book that, and of course, when you think about it, different studios, the album wasn't cheap to make. Tell me about that. Night of the
Yeah,
Opera.
yeah, yeah. Well, they even what the first part, or rather the last track, the national anthem. They'd recorded that before they even really started working on their fourth album. They did that rock version of the British national anthem just to play at the end of their shows. But then, so I think that's even the last thing they recorded at Trident before things fell apart with them. So, yeah, they'd recorded the last track before they even knew they were working on an album. But yeah, they got out of London to do a lot of the stuff, and recorded the basic tracks up there. I think it's Rockfield, to in this bucolic setting, and of course you're out of the big city, so away from all their temptations, and you could really just focus in on your work. But then all the overdubs were dubbed later, at studio after studio.
Think about Bohemian Rhapsody, and I was just looking up on Spotify the fact that they have 6 billion listened to songs. And I again, because of you don't know what you don't know till you're researching before and reading a book before you talk to someone of the it really says something about the band. But when I heard Bohemian Rhapsody, I didn't recognize it as being Queen because just the way it comes in. I remember, the old cliche staring at the speakers, which is a term I use way too much on my channel. But of going, what it's like Carry On Wayward Son in the way that I'm going, or Boston's More Than the Feeling. You've never heard this before. The meat and potatoes of radio hadn't heard something like that.
Well, my mother liked musicals, and so I liked musicals. I grew up listening to musicals, so I always got that side of Queen, and that was why I liked them. And that was really in part of Queen's aesthetic in the '70s, not so much the '80s when they got kind of too bombastic for my tastes. And my mother also liked, I guess what we'd call light classical music. So I grew up hearing Nutcracker Suite and Beethoven's Pastoral and some of the most well-known operas like La Boheme and Carmen. So I could kind of relate to that element in Bohemian Rhapsody as well. I mean, you knew they weren't trying to do serious opera, but it was certainly opera-esque, and
Yes.
it was meant to be a lot of fun. And it's interesting. I was after I finished this book, and I'm looking back on things now. I remember when I listened to Bohemian Rhapsody at the time it came out, and I never tried to figure out what it meant. I just liked the song. It's not like today where people pick things apart so much. But back then I could just enjoy it as a clever and inventive song.
A lot of metaphor in there, and it looks like it touches on Freddie's life, and it seems like a song on regret, redemption, all these things. What is it to you now?
The base thing would be to just go back to it as a piece of pure music and yeah, not put that analytical stuff in. But I remember the first time listening to it after Freddie's death, and suddenly the lines just have such resonance because he has just died. The real Freddie has just died. And the song is, all about death in a sense. I mean, he specifically refers to it. It's not even a metaphor. Murder and wishing you'd never been born, all that. It's a pretty heavy song. And yeah, it certainly took on a new resonance then after his death. I wonder, maybe it was kind of a metaphor for his life, but not a specific exact type metaphor.
Hmm.
I've done this myself sometimes in creative writing. You'll An event you went through that will inspire you to write a poem, say, but then when you write the poem, you do different things and add in other things that didn't happen at all. So it's like you used the real event as sort of a launch pad, and then you bring your own things in it. So that's why maybe that's another reason why he couldn't say, well, this song is about such and such, because it was and it wasn't. But then it was pretty typical of Freddie to not talk about any of his songs really, which I think is really interesting for a songwriter. Because it wasn't just Bohemian Rhapsody, it's obviously more complicated and complex. He really didn't, talk about what his songs meant much at all, especially after Queen got big. He was more like, whatever you get out of it, that's fine.
You look at the top 10 of Queen, there's only one song in the top 10 that's from A Night at the Opera, even though that's like the classic of all of them. But it says something about the band too. They kept, they kept speaking to people. I mean, a lot of the stuff from the 80s is in there, and switching decades is difficult for a lot of bands.
Well, it's interesting with Queen too, in that when they switched decades, they really, they kind of lost their US audience, but the rest of the world audience was big enough that it didn't matter to them. Brian had said, yes, for a moment there, we were the biggest band in the world. But then with Hot Space, that audience just dissipated in the US.
Yeah.
But it stayed strong elsewhere in the world, so they could continue to do these lucrative tours elsewhere. So they didn't really worry about not making it in America. But then I think, maybe they left it too late a bit, and they
Mhm.
couldn't make up all that lost time.
It's an interesting album because I bought it because of Bohemian Rhapsody, but then I bought it and I was ready for the fact that he'd go from Death on Two Legs, Kiss My Ass Goodbye, this kind of rockin' song, great tune to, and then he goes vaudeville.
Yeah.
Lazing on a Sunday afternoon. And I remember going on previous, I mean, there's a few songs, Seaside Rendezvous, Good Company, Brian's song, which by the way, I always thought was Beatlesque, even though it is, like you had pointed out those songs that on that album. Heard Seaside, Good Company, I went, that's the Beatles. Did you ever get that?
No, I mean, I love the Beatles too, but yeah, no, I didn't think of that. But the two songs you mentioned, Lazy on a Sunday Afternoon and Seaside Rendezvous, those are sort of kind of lesser regarded songs, especially Lazy on a Sunday Afternoon because it's only about a minute and something. But I really like that style. So they might be the two tracks I play the most after Bohemian Rhapsody.
Found that those kind of songs are the songs that made people who might be wider than rock go, hey, look what these guys are doing. Like, I can't believe they
Yeah.
put that as the second song on the album.
Well, I think partly there it's because of the contrast that you just pointed out about the raging anger and then this sort of foppish type thing. It's just such an abrupt contrast. But until writing this book, I don't know that I knew all the painstaking effort that Brian put into Good Company, creating the horn sounds on his guitar, like note by note. He even said, I don't think I could do that today. But just that kind of painstaking effort in there. And the other thing about that song is that I've always liked this when songwriters do this. It has, this bright kind of upbeat backing, but it's really a depressing song if you listen to the lyrics and just sort of, it's about this man's wasted life in a sense. And so very bittersweet. And that in itself was quite interesting too.
It's interesting you mentioned that, of course, Brian May is like a contradiction of the fact that here's this incredibly smart, one of the smartest guys in the history of rock and roll, who's a rock star.
Yeah, well, he's a doctor now, isn't he? I think he's Doctor May, with all his work in astrophysics. That might be wrong, but you know what I mean, the
Hmm.
star stuff. He brought that onto Night at the Opera as well, which I also don't think I realized at first in 39, where it's a voyage, but it's a spaceship, not a seafaring ship. So yeah, he always brought those. I mean, yeah, I do think it's fascinating that he has this esoteric side to him, and then he writes a song like "Fat Bottom Girls."
When I heard "We Will Rock You" and "We Are the Champions," I remember thinking, there's something important going on here, but it's so damn simple. But there's something, I don't know how. I mean, there's brilliance and simplicity. The Beatles showed us that. But when I heard those songs, I remember going, this is like caveman music. But of course, they ended up being, like campfire sort of songs that last forever.
Yeah, the two sporting arena hits, each of them in their own way, tailor made.
What was your reaction when you heard those songs in that era of Queen? I'm curious. News of the World.
Well, let's see. So yeah, we'd had Night at the Opera and Day at the Races. Um, well, it was a much harder sound. So that was kind of a surprise. But yeah, I did like those two songs. There were, I don't know, was that one of the albums? I think that's one of the albums where I would tend to just play one side. So I would play side one a lot of that album, but I didn't play side two. I would often do this with albums. I'd just stick to a side. That was in the days of vinyl, folks, not like your CDs today, which we didn't imagine. Should have kind of started doing something like that once I got a stereo with a tape deck where you could record. So then I would record an album. You could get a 90-minute cassette, and most albums were, under 45 minutes. So you could put a full album on one side of your cassette. So I guess that was like the forerunner of CDs. You didn't have to turn it over. But yeah, with News of the World, they did well for the moment because jazz brought some of that back. They did leave that kind of foppish side, aspect of themselves aside, and I like that foppish aspect. So I sort of missed that. You got some of it back on jazz, certainly with the bicycle race,
Mhm.
and Let Me Entertain You in a way.
You brought something up I didn't know, the Prophet song. I didn't know that was their longest song. I don't go around thinking about that, but I love those idiosyncratic facts that just drives me. That's a piece.
Yeah, I know. Brian had said that he felt that with Bohemian Rhapsody, it kind of stole his thunder from because Prophet song might have been the big one if Bohemian Rhapsody hadn't been on the album. I don't think the Prophet song would have done as well on radio. For one thing, you couldn't have had that canon section in the middle with the voices going from right to left. I'm sure the radio programmers would have just said, nope, nope, we need an edited version of this song. Um, but yeah, that's quite striking too.
What did you think of Rami Malek in the Bohemian Rhapsody? What did you think of his role and the movie in general? I'm curious.
Well, I had mixed feelings about the movie, but I mean he did a great job. He's not the writer of the script, the screenwriter. His performance was excellent. I just thought, I don't know, overall I thought it was kind of a too sanitized version of their story. But then I remember when they had a touring version of We Will Rock You, the musical, that came to town. And, I hadn't been in London, so I hadn't seen it there. And so a friend and I went, and I enjoyed it, but, it's very kind of light and family friendly. So I thought, so that's what they're going to do with the movie. I think, they're going to try and smooth some of those rough edges over. If it's about you, I think it's hard to step away. My next book that's coming out from this publisher is, well, it was Tom Petty at 75, but I think they've given it a new title. But in that book, I wrote about Warren Zane's biography of Tom Petty, which Tom cooperated with. But as he told Warren, he said, I don't want this to be authorized. Because in his mind, if he saw a book that was authorized by the subject, then that meant it was compromised. And he said, I don't want that kind of restriction on you. It was sort of that played out a different way in the Sticky Fingers book that was Jan Wenner's biography, Joe Hogan, who wrote it. And they'd known each other, and Wenner said, I need someone to write my biography. And Hogan said, okay, but it can't be authorized. And Wenner wasn't very happy about that, but he agreed. But then he was very unhappy when the book came out because it's not an entirely flattering portrait of him. And they were going to go on a big book tour and launch it with an event at the Rock Hall, and that all got canceled. And I assumed that was why Wenner then got his own autobiography out not long afterward.
What were some of the things that the biggest surprises you had about writing this book?
I don't think I'd ever really read about the process of recording it as much. I mean, Mark Blake did a great book on Freddie and Queen. Is This the Real Life? Very good. I recommend it. And he talks to the band about certainly how they recorded the albums, but really getting into the nitty gritty of things, like learning about how Brian did Good Company by recreating the horn section himself on different guitars, and and how painstaking that was. And the wind that you hear at the beginning of the Prophet song, that's an air conditioner.
Really?
Yeah. Which in a way kind of takes the magic out of it. But it's fascinating to learn. I found this really detailed article in Sound on Sound where they talk to Roy Thomas Baker. So that's probably why it gets more into nitty gritty, because I think the musicians are not going to pay as much attention to it. And just he talked about a lot of the details of making the record and just going back to a time that even though they were using probably state of the art studios then, still it wasn't quite enough for what they had to do. Or Roy would say there are sounds that you could do with a machine now that didn't exist then. So we had to figure out how to do that and distort their voice. And just things like when they'd be doing backing vocals sometimes, he said maybe there'd be something a little off, maybe a wrong note here or a harmony that wasn't quite right, and they'd just leave it.
Yeah.
And now with everything digitally, just whoop, take it out or auto tune it or something. But I think, it gives it more of a warmth and a human feeling to it.
So Bohemian Rhapsody just 2.7 billion. Don't Stop Me Now 2.2. I was surprised by that. Another one bites the dust 2.1. Under Pressure 1.8. We Will Rock You 1.4. And Crazy Little Thing Called Love 1 billion. There you go.
Wow. Don't Stop Me Now. It's sort of funny that song is so popular and is used in commercials and stuff when really, it's a song about licentiousness, basically. Sex and drugs, as all the band members admitted. And this was before I was working on the book, but here was something I hadn't realized. So at the end of the Bohemian Rhapsody movie, they show part of the promo clip for that, or maybe they show the whole thing. I can't remember. For Don't Stop Me Now, and it's the real one with the real band. and you see Freddie there, and he's playing the piano with his leather jacket and the T-shirt, and there was enough of the T-shirt that I realized it was a T-shirt for the Mine Shaft, this hardcore gay men's sex club in New York. And I thought, wow, he's actually wearing that in the video. And back then you didn't see videos as much. You had to wait until a TV station showed it, or maybe you'd see it in a movie theater or something. And I probably saw it then, but as I don't know, a teenager or whatever, that meant absolutely nothing to me.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of the Mine Shaft, and I dare say probably at that time, late 70s, probably maybe as many as 90% of the viewers, 95% had not heard of it either. But that was surprising to just do something that bold in a video. Here's something that it's not really about the album, but when I was researching it, there's they put out issues of like Queen magazines that will reprint older articles from the 70s, like from New Musical Express and Melody Maker. Hmm. So there was an interview from, I think it's about 74, and Freddie is talking with Julie Webb from, this would be NME, the New Musical Express, who he had a good rapport with. He gave her, later on when they're doing Night at the Opera, he gives her a rundown of the songs, and he obviously liked her quite a bit. So they're doing this interview, and he's talking to her about his experiences in boarding school when he was a young teenager, and how he goes, oh yes, I had the odd schoolmaster chasing after me. And she goes, well, what about actually being bent, meaning gay? And he says, oh, you're a crafty cow. Well, let me put it this way. I've had my share of schoolboy pranks, etc., and goes on and on. And I would have read that when I first got the magazine. But then in researching this, what really struck me on reading this is that she says, oh, how about actually being bent? And at this point, he could have just said something like, oh, darling, I'm living with a girlfriend, which he was. That would not have been a lie. He was living with a girlfriend then. But instead, he equivocates a bit and sort of makes references to maybe things in the past. Oh, this is in the past, but is it really? And I thought, wow, that's interesting that he sort of equivocated there instead of just, saying, oh, I'm living with a woman right now. And that made me think perhaps there was this side to him that did wish he could be more relaxed and open and not have to cover things up. Because here was a perfect place to cover that up. And yet he chooses not to. He kind of leaves the issue hanging. So that was really interesting.
It was people like Elton John and Freddie Mercury, and it's like Bruce Hornsby got me into blues and jazz and all this other stuff because I trusted him. I trusted Elton. I trusted Freddie Mercury. It's amazing. People always talk about the fact that people left these singers because they were gay. I couldn't imagine that. But there's that other side of it that, yeah, they taught me an awful lot about society and norms, what norms should be,
Actually, I was kind of clueless when I was a teenager, too. I didn't really know what gay meant. I knew I liked the camp side of Freddie's personality, but I didn't really think beyond what that meant. I knew that there were, but this was interesting. I did notice, though, say in my high school, it was very hard for a guy to say they liked the band Queen. Girls were the ones that were always talking about how great they thought Queen was. Yet when I went to my first Queen show, there's no shortage of males there. So obviously a lot of guys like Queen too, but not in my high school, maybe they wouldn't admit it.
Hope you enjoyed that. Remember, if you want to make a donation to the channel, if you want to help us out, there's a PayPal link at the very top of the description of all of our videos. You can join our Patreon and get access to hundreds of hours of interviews that we haven't put on YouTube yet. You'll be the first to see them for $6 and change. Also, if you want like a Rock History Music t-shirt or a cap, we have a swag store where you can pick it up. And remember, when you subscribe to the channel, make sure you click the bell notification so you don't miss anything. Comment on our videos, share them on social media, and like them. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take care.